distinguished colleagues, eminent policymakers, and revered members of the global scientific vanguard, I invite you to contemplate an exceedingly disconcerting prospect, namely, that our prevailing regulatory constructs for radio frequency, or RF radiation, are neither benignly antiquated nor simply in need of incremental revision. Rather, they constitute an inherently fraudulent edifice, meticulously contrived to shield corporate interests while jeopardizing the well-being of entire populations. Allow me to dissect this methodological deception with surgical precision and intellectual granularity. The paradox of 19th century science in a 21st century milieu. Let us commence by interrogating the cognitive foundation upon which modern RF guidelines rest. The bedrock of current exposure limits remains wedded to 19th century thermodynamic notions, specifically the Arrhenius equation, published in 1889, which revolves around the simplistic assumption that heat constitutes the sole vector of biological harm. In that primordial scientific epoch, the synergy between electromagnetic fields and living organisms was not merely unexplored, it was inconceivable. Today we inhabit a radically different epistemic landscape. Genomic science has elucidated the intricacies of DNA repair mechanisms and epigenetic modulation. Cellular physiology has uncovered how electromagnetic fields can trigger voltage-gated ion channel disturbances, spur oxidative stress, and induce DNA single and double-strand breaks, all of which can occur without any discernible temperature elevation. Quantum biology and biophysics increasingly highlight that subthermal electromagnetic phenomena can orchestrate signaling pathways at subcellular levels, a domain wholly unaddressed by 19th century thermodynamic constraints. Hence, a regulatory framework presupposing that if no heat is generated, no harm is inflicted displays an intransigent recalcitrance to contemporary scientific realities, resembling a scholarly anachronism unworthy of modern policy discourse. The legislative coup of 1996, entrenching systemic regulatory capture. It would be disingenuous to attribute this misalignment solely to historical inertia. In 1996, a tripartite legal and institutional coup ensured that thermal-only RF standards would remain enshrined in the annals of national policy. Transfer of RF oversight to the FCC. The Federal Communications Commission, or FCC, an entity bereft of substantive biomedical expertise, was suddenly endowed with exclusive jurisdiction over RF safety. The Environmental Protection Agency, or EPA, which possessed the capacity to integrate biologically relevant paradigms, was systematically defunded regarding electromagnetic research. Section 704 of the Telecommunications Act. This legislative provision actively preempted localities from invoking health concerns to oppose cell tower placements, effectively annihilating both the First Amendment right to petition governmental redress for public health grievances and the 10th Amendment's promise of states' rights. The synergy between industry demands and congressional compliance yielded a legal firewall impervious to scientific scrutiny. Defunding of the EPA's RF division. With the EPA poised to promulgate stricter biologically cognizant standards, industry forces lobbied to curtail its research budget. The eventual cessation of EPA's RF oversight left an intellectual void, one rapidly filled by the thermal-centric FCC model, which conveniently mapped onto telecom industry imperatives. Far from an unfortunate confluence of administrative happenstance, these events form an orchestrated tapestry of regulatory capture, wherein corporate imperatives superseded any meaningful stewardship of public health. The corpus of suppressed science, from military findings to national toxicology programs. Let us pivot to the suppressed or marginalized corpus of scientific evidence attesting to non-thermal, biologically significant effects. Military research from the 1970s to the 1980s. Classified U.S. Air Force and naval studies demonstrated that RF fields provoke cognitive impairments, immune dysregulation, and neurological perturbations at subthermal intensities. This voluminous data remained largely unincorporated into civilian exposure standards. Henry Lai's DNA breakage studies. In the mid-1990s, Dr. Lai documented RF-induced DNA fragmentation. The ensuing wargaming memo reveals the telecom industry's systematic efforts to discredit and undermine his findings. Bioinitiative Report. An extensive review of over 1,300 peer-reviewed papers detailing oxidative stress, fertility impacts, and neurological disorders related to low-level RF exposure. Policy gatekeepers effectively dismissed these data on the grounds that no heating equals no harm. National Toxicology Program, NTP, 2018, study. This $30 million government endeavor found clear evidence of carcinogenic activity, particularly schwannomas and gliomas, in animal models exposed to cell phone radiation at levels consistent with human usage. Instead of prompting a regulatory reevaluation, funding was curtailed, a direct contravention of Public Law 90-602, mandating continual research into radiation hazards. Such maneuvers betray a pattern. Whenever rigorous evidence contravenes the thermal-only paradigm, it is either ignored, defunded, or shrouded in legal and bureaucratic obfuscation. Nonlinear phenomena, the event horizon of biological complexity. A hallmark of modern bioelectromagnetic research is the nonlinear and often counterintuitive relationship between exposure parameters, such as power density, duration, and modulation, and resultant physiological effects. Several pivotal findings underscore this. Paradoxical dose response. Lower intensities can produce disproportionate biological impacts compared to higher intensities, a phenomenon the thermal model cannot reconcile. Intermittent versus continuous exposure. Short bursts at moderate intensities sometimes induce greater damage than sustained lower-level exposures due to cellular stress responses that fail to activate fully in the absence of prolonged stimulus. Temporal windows of vulnerability. Developing organisms, like fetuses and young children, and individuals with compromised health exhibit heightened sensitivity to non-thermal effects. Such observations unequivocally invalidate any regulatory premise contending that only intensity and duration above thermal thresholds matter. They compel us to adopt 21st-century frameworks that incorporate nonlinear, frequency-dependent dynamics, frameworks anathema to the 1996 guidelines. The ethical and public health ramifications of systemic deception. The real-world consequences of entrenching an archaic, industry-curated standard are both profound and pervasive. Cancer epidemiology, clusters of gliomas, acoustic neuromas, and other malignancies have emerged near high-power antenna installations, with epidemiological data repeatedly ignored or downplayed. Neurocognitive deficits, incidences of ADHD, autism spectrum disorders, and degenerative neurological conditions are increasingly correlated with chronic RF exposure, suggesting an urgent re-examination of precautionary thresholds. Reproductive dysfunction. The decline in sperm quality, heightened rates of miscarriage, and documented endocrine disruption implicate subthermal RF fields as a potentially critical factor in unfolding fertility crises. Stifled innovation in therapeutics. Paradoxically, the same non-thermal mechanisms that might facilitate electromagnetic cancer therapies, such as therabionic devices, remain obfuscated by regulatory bodies claiming non-thermal interactions are scientifically implausible. Thus, valuable medical avenues languish in obscurity. A blueprint for rectification toward a genuine science-based paradigm. To extricate ourselves from this intellectual and ethical quagmire, we must enact transformational reforms. Rescind FCC's thermal-only model. Replace archaic standards with biologically based guidelines, accounting for non-thermal phenomena, oxidative stress, and epigenetic modulation. Repeal Section 704 of the Telecommunications Act. Restore constitutional protections, thereby empowering municipalities to invoke health considerations in local zoning and infrastructure decisions. Mandate Li-Fi, fiber optics, and space-based broadband. Minimize terrestrial RF saturation by incentivizing light-based communication, LeFi, and fostering satellite-driven connectivity solutions. Reinstate independent research. Fully fund renewed investigations under Public Law 90/602, ensuring transparency and independence from telecom industry influence. Formal congressional and judicial inquiries. Demand thorough probes into the defunding of the EPA's RF branch, the suppression of the NTP study, and the labyrinthine networks of industry lobbying that engineered our present deficient status quo. Conclusion: reclaiming scientific integrity and ethical governance. In summation, the extant FCC guidelines, frozen in a thermodynamic worldview from the late 19th century, perpetuate a state of scientific, political, and ethical farce. The result is not merely a minor regulatory oversight. It is a carefully orchestrated subversion of public health imperatives in favor of industry profit margins. We, as the stewards of rigorous inquiry and policy rectitude, must call for the immediate dismantling of this fraudulent regime. We must champion a framework that aligns with the empirical truths of modern biology, honors the constitutional prerogative to protect communities, and upholds the bedrock values of scientific transparency. Let us not look back upon this era, decades hence, with the admonishment that we knew, yet we did nothing. The time has come to reclaim our collective future with honesty, intellectual rigor, and unwavering moral clarity. Ex scientia vera, ex prudentia actio, from knowledge, truth, from wisdom, action. Thank you for your intellectual engagement and dedication to safeguarding the common good.